Believe it or not, this is the final week in Genesis. We've been in it over a year, a long journey. So it's been quite a study. I've learned a lot. I hope you have. We have looked at Genesis verse by verse and gone through lots of details in it. Basically, there's 6 sections in the book of Genesis as I outline it. And we've gone through those early events of the universe in chapters 1 through 11, the generations of Terah, including Abram, who becomes Abraham, and the promise that God makes with him in Genesis 11, verse 27 through chapter 25, verse 11. So you got the early part of history in 1 through 11, and then Abraham comes on the scene in 11, end of 11, chapter 11 to chapter 25. The record of Ishmael and the 12 princes, which is only 7 verses or so in Genesis 25, 12 through 18. So it's its own section because they were not part of God's chosen people, although they were the seed of Abraham. And so God blessed them, and they are still part of our world today. Then section 4 was the record of Isaac and his twin sons Esau and Jacob, who were born to Rebekah, 25 through 35. So we see Isaac and his family and what goes on there. Really very early on, then in chapter 36 and 37, we see, in the first part of verse 1 of 37, we see Esau, who is Edom, the father of the Edomites, and the sons and grandsons that come to him. Then the record of Jacob's family through his 12 sons, and the focus is on Joseph in the last part of the book. That's the 6th section. It runs from 37 through 50. We're going to finalize that today. And Joseph is a key player, although Jacob is still on the scene. Even today, we're going to finish out with the death of Jacob. We looked at that briefly last week. But so Jacob has been over half this book. And so a lot of the story about Jacob, not always good, not always easy, been a struggle for him. I mean, he's at times, he's been at times a good example, at times a bad example. But God used him. He was the one chosen to be the seed of promise in the sense that he would produce that. And so it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so as we come to this final chapter, it's actually down in section N of the 6th section because it's a long section. So the 6th section, the N section, is feel like I'm in a football stadium or a basketball stadium or arena. Jacob's final instructions, that's chapter 49 there, 29 through 33, and Joseph's faith in God and his plans for his life and future. And so chapter 50 focuses more on Jacob, on Joseph and what he does, but it does give the first part of it the burial of Jacob. The first part there is Jacob's final instructions for his burial, and then he dies. So, 29 through 33. The second section is the burial of Jacob in true Egyptian form. And then the final section, as he closes out the book closes out, Joseph's faith in God and his plans for his life and future. And so we're going to see some incredible stuff that Joseph was a type of Christ. Joseph was a godly man. I find him remarkable in so many ways. And even today, as we close out this book, it ends with a positive note in the sense that of Joseph being a godly example of what it means to walk by faith. And so let's jump in. Anybody have any questions about that outline, though, before we do it? Or what we studied so far? I don't know. That's too long ago. I don't know if I can remember that far back. And so, all right. Genesis 49, verse 29. Then he gave them instructions, talking about Jacob. I am about to be gathered to my people. I love that phrase. I think I'm going to use that. It was first used of Abraham. I'm going to be gathered to my people in Genesis 25:8. It was used by Ishmael, or of Ishmael in 25:17. Then it was used of Isaac in chapter 35, verse 29. Do you see the pattern? Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and at this point, now Jacob's going to use that phrase. I'm going to be gathered to my people. And what does that tell you about their life and who they are?
They're believers.
They're believers. He doesn't doubt where he's going. And I'm going to be with him. I'm going to be gathered to my people. I'm going to see my folks. And so now you could say, well, it just represented the grave. We're going to go to the grave like our folks did. I don't think that was all that it says. I'm going to be, it sounds like he had a positive perspective of life after death. And so I don't know, it wasn't full blown here, what they understand, what we understand today. I got a timeline. You want to see my, we got all kinds of stuff that we can explain and go through, but you look at it, I think I'm going to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. Remember, that was purchased back in Genesis 25 and verse 9. The cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan. Now, can you get any more precise? I mean, he's kind of giving you, he could give you some GPS, but they didn't have it back then. But
that's pretty close.
That's pretty close. I mean, you get down to, it's around the area of Hebron. By the way, when we did back at Machpelah, that is the oldest monument in the land of Palestine that exists today. It goes back to this time. It goes back to Abraham. That's 2000 BC. This is 2021. So that's 4,000 plus years ago. And that building, it's a newer building there, but parts of that stuff still go down to the caves where those folks were buried. And that's been a monument since ancient times. So it's still there. And a lot of things we don't know exactly where they were. That one we know exactly where it was because it's been in existence all through history. And it's talked about in the Old Testament. And so, and recognized by the Jewish people that this is the spot. So,
does anybody know if they allow tourists today to
they do.
There?
They don't get to go back in the caves, but you do go into the upper part of it. There are several. They built a lot of times they built a building on it. And even when the Muslims ruled, they kept that for because Muslims go back to Abraham. So that's a big deal to them. And so he's buried there. And so you go, well, can we see his grave? Well, I don't know that they found the bones. They found bones and stuff in some of those caves. There are a double cave back in there that they found and found human bones and stuff. But it was an ancient burial site, and Abraham bought that to bury Sarah. And he buried her, and then he was buried there, and then so others have been buried there. So as a whole, is a burial site. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field. Remember, that's the details. He's going back to the details. He bought the field and the cave as a burial place from Ephron, the Hittite. There, Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried, Genesis 23. Then Isaac, Genesis 35. Then his wife Rebekah, Genesis 49, verse 31, were buried. And there I buried Leah. So remember, that was his first wife. It was supposed to be Rachel, but it ended up being Leah. So he buried Leah there. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. So remember back in Genesis 23, verse 20, they got a deed for the field and the cave. Now, anybody says that the Jewish people don't own, they just stole it from the people. They didn't steal it. They bought it. Parts of it. They purchased. They did conquer other parts of it, but so people can't say they didn't own any of it. Remember Abraham, and later Isaac buys some stuff, and so Jacob even says he got some stuff, and so he bought something. So they did buy parts of that. So he goes on. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed. So he'd kind of set up, and so he gets back in the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. He died. But once again, it's not on a negative note necessarily, but it's still a negative thing because death is an enemy. And so death, really, God didn't, I think, want that, but that was part of life because people were sinful. And so Jacob instructed his sons to bury him there at Machpelah. He was 147 years old. I think that's pretty good. Yeah, so now we're going to see what happens after that, the magnificent burial. Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him and kissed him. I appreciate Joseph. As a man, he is very impressive, but I appreciate this part of him because I see him as he was a tough guy, but he was also a tender guy. And I think those are good qualities. I think both of those. I think as guys, we need to be tough, but I think we also need to be tender. And he wasn't aloof from life. He wasn't distant from life. He let life impact him. And in this case, his dad, he was close to his dad. His dad loved him. He was a favorite with his dad, with Jacob. And he wept over him. And you go, well, didn't he believe in resurrection? And I think he understood that. We're going to see even that. But he still felt the loss. It says we don't grieve like those who have no hope. We still grieve. The funeral I did this morning, I told the folks, listen, we're going to shed some, and the mom was shedding tears. And that's okay. I didn't get on her. God didn't get on him. Joseph wept 6 times in the text and the chapters we've seen him. Just to give you a quick rundown, chapter 42, when his brothers confessed, remember they were confessing in language they didn't think he understood. He understood them, and he went out. He had to leave the room and go out and weep because his brothers confessed doing wrong to him. That moved him. That was on their first visit. Chapter 43, verse 30, when he saw his brother Benjamin, when they came back the second trip, he went out and wept. Couldn't restrain himself. In chapter 45, verse 2, he reveals himself to his brothers, and he weeps. In chapter 45, verse 14, Joseph tells his brothers to go get Jacob and their families because there's going to be a famine for 5 more years. And he thinks about it, and he weeps because he wants to protect his family. He realizes it's going to be bad for a long time, and the family probably wouldn't survive if they didn't. So he weeps there. Chapter 50, verse 1 here, he weeps at the death of Jacob. He weeps, and we're going to see that he's going to weep one more time in verse 17, but we'll get there when we get there. But this guy was amazing. He withstood a lot of pressure, a lot of tough stuff, but God used him and grew him, and he developed, but he was still open in so many ways, and I appreciate him. Verse 2, then Joseph directed the physicians in his service, that's interesting, to embalm his father Israel. Now, we don't know that the Jewish people ever practiced embalming, but apparently we know the Egyptians did. Most of us can go to the British Museum or go online and see all the mummies and the daddies. No, just if you've never seen a mummy, I'm sorry, that's so bad. You got to get a joke in every once in a while, don't you? So, mummies are interesting things as you look at them because they unwrap some of those if you go to the British Museum, and I've been to the British Museum, and it's pretty remarkable what they have. And so to look at a 3,000-year-old mummy and the skin, you can still see. And I read all about how they do it. And so it's a normal process was a 70-day process, although here it mentions that it was 40 days. So let me give it to you. So the physicians embalmed him, it says, in verse 3 said, taking a full 40 days, for that was a time required for embalming. That was a normal time for the drying phase. But normally there was a purification and a cleansing phase for 15 days. And then there was a 15 days after that where they wrapped the body in usually around 20 layers, and they put resin in it. And it was very tightly wrapped to preserve that. They took all the organs out. They took the brain out. They didn't know what the brain was back then, but they just threw that away, or they put it in a jar sometimes. But then the organs they took out because those decayed very quickly and would cause the body to rot. But with the body, then they stuffed the body with sawdust or some type of leaves or some dried leaves, and to keep it from collapsing. They put stuff in the head to keep it from collapsing. and then they wrapped them in the strips of cloth and put resin on it to keep it together, and it would preserve a body. And so we have some of those that are pretty well preserved. So it's really remarkable. But he had him done, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. The mourning time for Pharaoh was 72 days. So Jacob got 70. So what does that tell you about Jacob?
They liked him.
They liked him. That's way up there. To take, yeah, that's a big deal. So, the mourning 70 days. You go, how did they know Jacob? Well, they knew his son. But because of that, Joseph loved his dad, and Joseph was impacted, and so they're taking care of Joseph's dad. When the days of mourning had passed, 70 days, Pharaoh gets 72. Joseph said to Pharaoh's court. Now, the word that's used there is a Hebrew word bayet. It's a word that means house or family. Well, these are people that are part of his family. So, and now it's interesting because it uses a couple of different Hebrew words for court in this text. You wouldn't know it if you didn't. Anyway, but it goes on and says, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, "If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me." Now, couldn't he go to Pharaoh? He probably couldn't during the morning time. That was not usually, you didn't, if you're in mourning, you kind of stayed with your family. So he's staying with his family, caring for his dad. That's honoring his dad. So that's probably one reason that this took place instead of him going directly to Pharaoh. Although you'd kind of go, well, maybe he didn't, but it says, "Speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father. Then I will return." So he guarantees he's going to go, but he's going to come back. I think that's significant. Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father. Joseph is returning to Canaan. It's the first time in 39 years. He hadn't been back. That's a long time, 39 years. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him. The dignitaries of his court, that's the same word that's used by it. The dignitaries is the word zakane. Zakane was the word for elder. Now, these are the older guys. So they had a bunch of the elders of his court that knew Joseph, went along with him. And a bunch of people. It was a huge entourage. So you had Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court, that's the second group of people, besides all the members of Joseph's household, that's his brothers and probably their spouses, and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children, so if they're too young to go in the flocks, they left all the flocks and possessions. So they left their possessions and kids, but most of the family went on this entourage. You can imagine, what size do you think it was? Doesn't tell us.
Should have been about 150 people.
Well, then it says in verse 9, chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. So if you take all that troop and then you say with his family, remember his family was 70. So if you include Joseph in that, it's 75. So you look at the size of that and you go, that's a pretty, and then plus all the court officials, then you take the soldiers. And why do you think the soldiers and the charioteers went? Horsemen.
He was a well-to-do person. He was in charge of all the grain, so he was important.
He was important. And they're also protecting the family of Pharaoh. So some of his family went. So those court officials were family. So you got this big entourage, and so this big troop of people, and they're going to, and they don't want robbers or anybody to approach them, so they had a contingent of troops with them. So they're all traveling up, and they go up. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, first time I've seen the threshing floor of Atad. It's the first use in the book of Genesis. It's used in verse 10 and 11 there. The word Atad is an interesting word. I think that could sound like a person. It could be a person. but the word atad in Hebrew means thorn bush or a bramble. You know what I'm talking about? Like, so maybe it's some field where there's a thorn bush. But when they reached that place, but it could have been some guy named Atad that they came to. It's interesting because this name was changed because of this event right here. Because that place, the threshing floor of Atad, became known as Abel Mizraim, which is the Hebrew for the meadow or the morning of Egypt, because of this event. They changed the name of the place because of what happened there. So it says, as they reached this threshing floor, now threshing floor was where they harvested grain, did some of that, you know, that's a word used there, but the word thorns or brambles, thorn bush. It's apparently between west of the Jordan and the Jericho. Jericho's down south there in Israel. So if you look at that, near the Jordan, it says, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there, when they entered this, what they kind of is a land of Canaan, Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. Though they'd already mourned for 70 days. Now they're mourning for 7 days as they enter the land. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. That is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim, which technically Abel Mizraim means meadow of Egypt, but it was they later started calling it Ebal. Instead of Abel, they called it Ebal, and Ebal means mourning. Anyway, the way they use different language. Ebal of Mizraim is a word for Egypt. So it's a mourning. That place took on a new nickname. You know, we do that with places. When something happens there in history or in life, anyway, it becomes that place. So that's what took place. This event was known, was widespread, wasn't it? I mean, you think about it. It was not just a local event. This was known among the Canaanites, among the people who lived there. This big entourage happens, and it was not a secret, is what I'm saying. So what's going on here is impacting the area. So Jacob's son did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abram goes back through it again, had bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. So after burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt. Pretty quick. I mean, some of it gives details, and all of a sudden it goes, now he returns. So they don't tell about the trip going back down, but the event was burying his dad. And they don't tell the ceremony to it and all the different things that took place. But obviously the Egyptians had an elaborate burial process. They embalmed bodies. They built pyramids. The richer you were, the bigger the monument, and the more you had. And they loaded that stuff for the afterlife. You know, some of those had boats in them, huge boats. Great wealth, food. They were preparing you for the afterlife. That is not the way to be prepared for the afterlife. It's not going to do it. So it says, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. So everyone went back. The third section, Joseph's faith in God and his plans for his life and future. The final verses of Genesis. When Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? Guilty conscience. And his brothers had sold him into slavery. And so they're worried that Joseph, Dad's gone. And Joseph didn't hurt us because of Dad. That wasn't the reason Joseph didn't hurt him. But they're worried about it. And holding a grudge is an interesting word. It was the first use of that word for grudge was used back in Genesis 27, verse 41, where Esau held a grudge against his brother Jacob for stealing his birthright, which is really Jacob's birthright anyway, but he didn't have to, anyway, all that went on there. But that word is the same word that's used back there. It says, What if Jacob holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs, that word's interesting, the word evil or bad, we did to him? They were going to kill him. Instead, they sold him into slavery. So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father, not our father, your father left these instructions before he died. Okay. You think this really happened?
No.
Probably not. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. Now when the message came to him, Joseph wept. Again, that's the sixth and final time. The brothers are scared.
That's kind of fishy. So
What?
Please excuse Timmy from PE today, signed Timmy's dad.
Yeah. But you understand their fear. Their brother, he could do probably what he wanted. And they had done him wrong.
So why did he weep this time?
Why do you think? That's a great...
That he knew that that wasn't from dear old dad, and his brothers are still worried and actually have remorse for what they did, and are still trying to get out of any consequences.
Yes.
And he realizes that, but it could also be just like, my brothers don't believe me, they don't trust me.
And there's probably a sense where that's probably true. Obviously, they didn't, because they, to some degree, we put on other people what we kind of have in our own heart. And they kind of had a heart that was not really right in some ways. I think they'd gotten better and grown through the years, but they had threatened their brother. And, so they had some issues that were going on there. But anyway, I think he weeps because it breaks his heart. I think he's just a man that he wishes his brother that they had a better relationship, and he wishes that they didn't feel that way. But some of that, there are times in life, let's face it, we can't always resolve people's issues that they have about us.
After all he'd done for them.
After all he'd done.
And then they showed his lack of faith.
Yeah, this is like 50-something years later. I mean, isn't it? It's a long time. No, we're not when he dies. His dad died quicker than that, but his dad lived 17 years after, so 17 years down the road when they could do this. 17 years after they've been there. So he's been caring for him for 17 years. So the plague or the famine's all over, but they're still struggling. And so it's interesting what they say to him. When the brothers came, and his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. Remember, they were going to bow. Well, they keep bowing. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Now, why would he say that? What's that mean?
Not his place to judge.
God's a judge. God has a right to judge. Now, he's saying, I don't have a right to hold a grudge or revenge or any of that stuff because God is the judge. He's basically recognizing God's position to judge mankind. Now, does that mean we don't deal with people who do us wrong? No, I think we do. But, he's simply saying that, God's going to deal with you and you're going to answer to him. And God can do it a lot better than we can. God's always just. And so, am I in the place of God?
I wonder what their position is if they're in heaven today.
Oh, I think they are. But, yeah, but you kind of go, some of them might not have been believers.
God's in judge and they're in heaven.
Yeah, well, it's interesting as you think about it. Verse 20 is a great verse. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. That verse is incredible. It's worth remembering. You intended it to harm me. That's reality, isn't it? He knew that they wanted to harm him. He was the favorite. He was going to rule them. His dad had even put him over them already. 17-year-old. Older brothers ain't going to work. But anyway, they meant to harm him, but he said God intended this for good. God had a plan. That's called providence. Remember, we made a distinction. Sovereignty is God's rule. Providence is God carrying out his plans. So God's provident plans were carried out in the life of Jacob and Joseph. And so now part of that plan included his using what his brothers did to harm him to provide for them. And that's what he's saying. And so he saw a whole different perspective of life. And when you see God in the formula or in the equation of life, to me it changes how we see life. If there's no God, you just think about what life's about. Why are we here? Why don't we do something? Why do we not do something? You almost go, it doesn't matter. And that's the way a lot of people live today. Or the best they can do is it's just mankind is God. And we just do it because we're nice, whatever that means. And then, so whatever values. But our world is just kind of lost there. But the brothers struggle with this. They had meant it to harm him. And that's reality. And Joseph knew it and they knew it. And God knows it. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. He reassured them and spoke kindly to them. He keeps doing it. Taking care of them and speaking kindly to them. So at this point, he doesn't put up any type of sign that he's against them or whatever. He says, I think he wants to reassure them. These guys are really insecure. And Joseph is really secure.
But they also did something really bad.
They did something really, really bad.
There's a lot of guilt.
Yeah. And it's hard to get rid of. But he forgives but he also reassures them. And what kind of restoration do you want? I mean, if you want to look at what restoration looks like, to me it's a Joseph, because he doesn't put up any barriers there with his brothers. He's real with them. He's honest with them. He doesn't sugarcoat what they did. But on the other hand, he doesn't hold it against them. And he provides for them and protects them and helps them and reassures them. So, tremendous example. No, that's an amazing passage right there. And we're going to come back to, as in the application, to verse 20, because it's such a good one. Verse 22, Joseph stayed in Egypt. So that happened 17, years after they'd gone into, or Jacob had come down into Egypt, stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years. That's 54 years later. So 54 years is 110 years. So Jacob had been dead for many years. And so, but he lives 54 more years before his death. And Saul, the third generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. It sounds like they were adopted. I don't know what the story is there, but it's that placed on the knees. Remember, that's what Jacob did with the sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, the sons of Joseph. He placed them on his knees to adopt him as his sons, and they inherited what he would have gotten. Joseph, instead of Joseph getting that, his two sons got that. So, and it sounds like some way they were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. So did he adopt them into the family? Verse 24, then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die. So apparently they're still alive. But God will surely come to your aid, and take you up out of this land. He's going to do a couple of things. God's going to come to your aid. He'll take you out of this land. What's that land? Where are they? Egypt. If I get it here, he'll take you out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he promises that God's going to take them out of the land, and he's going to come to their aid and take them out. Now, the word for come to your aid is an interesting word. Hebrew word's pakad. It's used 303 times. It means, it has three major meanings, but it means to look after someone, to visit someone, or to care for someone. If you'll remember in the prophecy in the New Testament by Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, he predicts that God's going to visit them. Now, that's a Greek word, but it's kind of the same idea that's here. So God's going to come to your aid. God's going to visit you. It's a big deal when God visits you. If the Pharaoh visits you, or the president visits you, that's a big deal. And so God's going to visit you. And so that's kind of the way what it's talking about here. And he says, God's going to come to your aid. He's going to rescue his people. He's not going to do that for 400 years, but he's going to do it. And he didn't know all the time frame of that. Well, I guess they did. They mentioned you're going to be enslaved 400 years. And they were. That had been mentioned earlier. And so Zechariah was speaking of the incarnation of Jesus. Jesus was going to be born. Luke chapter 1, verse 68. Praise be to the Lord. This is Zechariah's father, John the Baptist. The God of Israel, because he has come. The word to come is a word to visit. It's used in the word that's used for visiting someone is the word to come. So to visit to his people and redeem them. So God visits his people. And so he's going to come and help the Jewish people, and he's going to come later and help and redeem the Jewish people. So, and Joseph made the Israelites, the people that were there, swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid. That's the same word used again. He's going to come visit you. And then you must carry my bones up from this place. And guess what? When the Israelites left, what did they leave with?
Joseph's bones.
My goodness. Exodus 13, verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear on an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid. He just quotes right from the Bible. And then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. So when you leave Egypt, take my bones with you. So you don't have to make a special entourage, but when you leave, take me with you. And Joseph died at the age of 110. If you look at ancient Egyptian literature, 110 was considered the perfect age. I don't know why, but that Egyptian, I don't know if I want to live to 110, but Joseph was 110 years old. After they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Now that's interesting. Placed in a coffin.
Something portable.
Sarcophagus. They normally had a holding place. The Jews often didn't do that. They would usually have niches and stuff they would carve out of the rock and put people in there and let their body, the flesh kind of disintegrate, and then they would take the bones and put them in what was called an ossuary, which was a bone box, and so your bones until they turned to dust. So that's we found a bone box in the ancient world that had the name, what was it, Jacob, or one of the names of the brothers of Jesus, the brother of Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus. And they found that ossuary. I don't know if that's, there were other people named James and had Jesus back in the ancient world, but it's interesting. They have found ancient bone box with that. But that's the way the Jewish people did it. They did a lot differently than the Egyptian people. But you realize Joseph was a Hebrew living among the Egyptians. So they embalmed his body and placed him in a coffin. So,
It had Tom.
what's that?
When Tom had a point, it had to be portable if you knew he was gonna get carried back.
Yeah,
Maybe
it's
it
probably
had
not a big
wheels.
heavy one. Yeah, probably one of the smaller, like the mummy cases that you see. Those were wooden and things of that sort. But that could have been. So as I looked at this chapter and thought about it, I see both of these guys, Jacob and Joseph, as men of faith. And I see that they believe in God. That's what starts it. Just like Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness, Genesis 15:6. That's a key verse in the Old Testament. I think both of these guys believed in God. Now, they believed in God's plans. They sought God's direction, blessing. Now, did they always do right? Joseph pretty well did pretty much, most of the time did right. Jacob didn't always do it. But, his son, Joseph was an amazing. I'm sure he still wasn't perfect, but I think he was trying to do right and live for God. I think Jacob tried to do right too. Once again, he was the one that had the 12 sons and 4 wives and kind of a big mess of a family and all kinds of things. But he still believed in the plans of God, and you can see it throughout his life. And he says God's got a plan to take, and that's why they buried him back in the land of promise. He was supposed to be in that land of promise, and the people of Israel were supposed to be in the promised land. And so that was a land given to Abraham. And so they were descendants, and they were carrying on the fulfilling the promise given to Abraham. And so I also believe that they walked by faith. They lived their lives trusting God to work. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Now, trusting, walking by faith in God and His plans, what does that look like? What does it look like?
Well, hopefully you're not consumed by worry
Okay,
all the time.
that's true. What else? What can you learn from Joseph or Jacob or Joseph?
We're in Providence, so there's a lot of evils in Providence, and we need to avoid them to the extent we can.
Yeah, it's interesting because, these guys did, the providence is the plan of God. And so you think about that. God has a plan for us. We don't always know the details of that plan, but sometimes these guys knew parts of them. And so they trusted or believed in God's providence, care. And that Genesis 50:20 really points that out. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. See the opposite? One seeks evil, one's good. So God, the same event, when he was sold into captivity and then sold later and put in prison, the people that were doing it meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. We have a good God. He doesn't do evil. And you go, how can that be? How can something be evil and good at the same time? It's what it accomplishes. They just wanted to get him killed. You think about it, the brothers just wanted him to die, get out of their hair. But God had a plan to promote him, not put him down or kill him. He used Jacob to accomplish his plans, which would protect his brothers, which means that you had the 12 tribes of Israel down in Egypt where they could grow and flourish and survive. Now we're going to see that they're going to survive under really harsh circumstances because it's not going to be good for all that time. And even Abraham knew that his offspring would be enslaved in the future. And they become slaves. But as slaves, they became strong. So once again, God's able to take what's evil and make it good. So I look at that and I go, that's what providence is. And so I had a pastor friend of mine that talked about, you know, you can have 20/20 vision. You know, 20/20 vision is considered as good as it gets. I guess maybe you can have 20/15. Here people go 20/10 or whatever that it means. But 20/20 vision is great vision. And he told us, he said, no, you need to have 50/20 vision. Genesis 50/20. Realizing that others may mean it to harm you, but God means it for good. And that changes the way we see things. When we start seeing the tough things, the bad things in our life, they were evil, and somebody may have really intended to hurt us or harm us, but God always intends it for good.
Kind of hard to see at the time.
Oh. And, you know, quite frankly, sometimes those, you know, becoming a slave, who would want that?
Even Joseph didn't know what was being unfolding at the time, but
He didn't.
as the Holy Spirit was revealed, was putting it all together, because he prayed a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure he didn't. And you know that he probably prayed for God's deliverance. And he worked, you know, remember he had the baker and you know, the cupbearer, and they forget him. So, you know, you just keep getting delayed, and you go 2 more years in prison. That's a long time. So you just go, he's trusting God to work. And he was a man of faith. And I think no matter what our circumstances, and once again, that's not denying the evil that others sometimes intend. We live in a world that does evil. At times we can do evil. Let's be honest about it. But even then, God intends stuff for good. And he's able to use it to grow us. Use it to transform us. Use us to transform and help other people. What if he uses this tough stuff we go through, which he did with Joseph? Joseph went through that process and becomes prime minister there in Egypt. And you go, how would that ever happen? It wouldn't, apart from the providence of God. Wasn't chance. Wasn't some election. Cheating. No, it was God's hand. God was working. I think there was cheating going on in the regional election, but I think God still got the guy out there. Now, that's an interesting one. I don't really like that, but you still go, part of that is why, as an American, you go, listen, we've got certain things we need to do. Even if I don't agree with what happened, we have a system, and I'm not going to go rebel against that system because that's not right, because God tells me not to do wrong things. And so now, does that mean that we can't stand up? But, you know, when you think about all the ways it works out in your life, all of a sudden it starts making a difference in how you live. You go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Well, I don't like that. Well, we may not like something, but we got to go, God's using things in our lives, and he uses the good and the bad, but he intends it for our good. So otherwise, to me, it's hard to function in life. Look at what this life of faith was also a life of forgiveness. He forgave his brothers. He'd forgiven them long before, but they asked him. Forgiveness, he freely forgives those who don't expect it. How do we know that? Because his brothers kept feeling guilty about it. They hadn't forgiven themselves in some ways. They're still guilty, and they're worried about he's going to take out revenge on them after Dad's dead. And so they're kind of trying to work it out. He forgave I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they've committed in treating you so badly. So that's them feeling pretty bad about all that stuff. Now forgive their sins. The word that's used there is the word nasah, and so it's a word that means to take something to lift it off of you, and so he's letting that go. The New Testament means to put it behind you, and so this whole picture, at times that word to forgive means different things, and that word could be used to lift a burden off. At times it was used to carry something. Other times it was used to pardon, to let it go in a sense. And so this context is obviously to forgive something. And that's, so it was a word, the word that was used for forgiveness was an everyday word that was used for lifting off burdens or carrying something. And you think about it, when somebody offends us, it's a burden that we carry. And when we let that go, when we take that off of us, and these brothers hadn't taken it off, and he had already done that. And they're asking him to do it. So he just reassures them, I've done that. And, and he comes back and says, he weeps that they don't really believe it, but he keeps doing it. And he goes on and says, I'm going to take care of you. And he reassures them, and he speaks kindly to them. So he's doing everything he can to communicate that God had transformed his life. He wasn't holding grudges, seeking revenge, out to get them. So to me, this is a picture of free forgiveness. Isn't that what we get from God? We never deserve it. God took our sin, we get his righteousness. He releases all our sins. He forgives all our iniquities. He took care of it. It's grace forgiveness. Charizomai is a word used in the New Testament. Charis is a word for grace. We don't deserve it. We never deserve God's forgiveness. But he sent his son and he paid for our sins. So that was a transaction that God made. So it was interesting, Jacob often lived a path or a life of suffering and hardship. But God used it to transform his world and to save his family and to save Egypt and to save that whole region of the world. I appreciate Joseph's suffering and ill treatment never hardened his heart. That weeping part, he kept tender. He could have gotten bitter, but he didn't. Just, as I've said before, I'm impressed. Joseph saw himself as a servant. He was a leader. Everywhere he went, he could organize and run stuff. He was really good at it. Had plans, had vision, had all that stuff. But he saw himself as a servant, I think, first to God and then others. He served Pharaoh. He served Potiphar. He served Pharaoh. He served wherever he went. He's going to serve his father, leading his brothers. They didn't like that, but he was still going to serve. He served everywhere he went. He was faithful in whatever he did. But he also, I think he saw himself as a servant, even of his brothers. The leaders that are good leaders are servants. So he had that, and he provides for them. How could he live a life of faith? How could Joseph live a life of faith? He knew that God meant it for good. He just knew it. And how do we know that? Well, he knew that God would keep his word and return his people to the promised land. Look at what it says in Hebrews 11:22. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, talking about this chapter, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. So the Hebrews 11 chapter, which is a chapter of faith, God's hall of faith, Joseph is in there about what happens right here. And it's pointing out that this guy was a man of faith. He was trusting God to work, and he knew that God was going to deliver the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. He just knew it was going to happen. So, Joseph, verse 26, the final verse, Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. John Corson wrote a commentary, it's a good commentary on the book of Genesis, and his final words of this book are this, and I really think it's good. Thus ends Genesis. The book that began with creation ends with a coffin. Starts with creation, ends with a coffin. The book that began in glory ends in a grave. The book that began with a living God ends with a dead man. The book that began with the brightness of heaven ends with the bones in Egypt. Then he says, why? Why? It, talking about Genesis, is the Holy Spirit's commentary on the condition of man. We are sinners. Number two, the repercussions of sin. There are repercussions, and it affects every one of us all the time. And third, the need of a Savior. And I would add, that was John Corson, but I would add also the promise that one's coming. And we know he's already come. So what was predicted from the very beginning at creation is going to be fulfilled and was fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And because of Jesus, we can know that others may intend stuff and our world may intend stuff for harm, but God means it for good or intends it for good. And so we can trust him to work. And you know what? We've read the rest of the story. We don't know what our life's going to hold. We don't know what's going to happen anywhere in the world or within our particular lives. We don't know what illnesses or struggles or surgeries or we know promotions or whatever is going to happen in our world. But we know God. And our world can do bad stuff and go through bad stuff, and so can we. But God's got a plan. Will you trust God in his plan? Some days it's a little harder. But, you know, when I read passages and guys like Joseph, I say, you know, if he can, I can. And you look at our lives, we've seen God's hand in our lives. And we've seen him work. And so we know that we have a good God. And he intends stuff for good. So let's trust him. Let's pray. Father, just thank you for our time. Thank you for these men. And Lord, I'm just amazed at the men in the book of Genesis, men and women. They are real people with real faults and struggles and lives. Not always real pretty. Not always honoring you or living the way they ought to. But Lord, you give your word and you keep your word. They didn't see all the promises that you gave them fulfilled, but they will. We haven't seen all the promises that you give us, but we will too. Help us to live by faith. Help us to honor you and trust you and walk with you. And even as we encounter struggles that we do not ask for or do not want, help us to live in your strength and power, realizing your providential hand, that you intend it for good, to save many lives. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.